This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
For many people, music is just entertainment. But we know there is much more than that. And basically, it's something that can give you a sense of things that are happening in society, in culture, and in history. And today we have someone who precisely works on that particular area, which is the connection between music and culture in general. Her name is Dr. Abby Anderton. She's a native from Oil City, Pennsylvania, a very interesting town because that's where the oil industry began and is still visited by many people, despite the fact that it's still a rather small town. And she has her master's and doctoral degrees in historical musicology from the University of Michigan. And today she's an assistant professor of music in the Department of Fine and Performing Arts at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk, Dr. Anderton.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here, Dean Romero.
No, it's my pleasure. The first question I always ask the guests coming here is, why do you choose this particular area for? Why musicology to begin with?
Okay. I think there are a lot of reasons that I chose this particular field, but one of them would be that music itself I find incredibly fascinating. And it's not just the actual music, but what the documents suggest. I'm teaching a jazz course this term, which I'm absolutely loving, and we're talking a lot about narratives of oppression and suppression, gender, race, all kinds of different things that can be rolled up and looked at through various angles of music. And music is, people like to say that it's the universal language. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I think every culture certainly has music in some capacity, and what it can reveal about the culture is why I find musicology so fascinating.
And that's something that is true not only to the music we know well, like the Western music, but also to culture whose music we know very little of.
Yes.
And actually people go to those places with microphones and tape recorders and trying to understand what's going on. In fact, even the Library of Congress of the United States sometimes send people to remote places, especially in the south of the U.S., in trying to have a record of the kind of music that is played and even interview people, because that's, if not, probably a lot of that information will be lost.
Yes, that's exactly right. These really fascinating oral histories and how they're captured and transcribed is something that I've also been interested in my work a little bit. With my world music class, we talked about this idea of doing field work, and I had the students write up sort of a mock field work plan. If they could go to any country in the world and make recordings, where would they go and what would their methodologies be? But you're absolutely right. This idea of capturing the sonic archive is something that I think students find really fascinating and really, really interesting.
Now, you chose, historians and areas in music history in many ways always concentrate on a particular period of time. And you chose post-war Germany. And one wonder why, because after the devastation of Second World War, probably there wasn't much to study, but you did find a lot of things to study.
Yeah, there was more there to study than I thought. I had a sort of transformative experience when I was a student. I was able to go to Berlin for a few months to study German, and I was really fascinated with how the city of Berlin was divided and why were there 3 opera houses, why were there multiple symphonic ensembles, and thinking about the way in which the Berlin Wall and the city's history had influenced how the musical culture developed there. And then I eventually came across a book, Alex Ross, The Rest is Noise. He's the music critic for The New Yorker. He wrote this great book about 20th century music, and in one of the chapters he talks about music in Germany after the Second World War. And when I was living in Berlin, I became really interested in how Germans post-1945 used their music to understand themselves and understand the world after the horrific events that had happened in Germany during the Second World War. And I decided I wanted to write a book about that topic.
Now, the title of your dissertation is Music Among the Ruins, Classical Music Propaganda and the American Cultural Agenda in West Berlin, 1945-49. This is really interesting. Not only you describe, yes, there was total ruin what was in Germany after the Second World War, but also the fact that to imagine that the Americans had a agenda, a propaganda agenda there. Explain to our audience what was going on in there, why the American government somehow tried to influence the development of music in Germany right after the Second World War.
So one of the reasons I found Berlin so fascinating is because it was cut into different sectors, and the Americans and the Russians were sort of in an early Cold War competition with each other already in 1945, 1946. And so the U.S. government actually employed people called music officers who would monitor, check up, promote certain American works, and also make sure that German music wasn't misused as Nazi propaganda after the Second World War. So they would import music, actually, by people like Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, William Schumann, and other American composers that they thought would promote quote-unquote American democratic values.
And some of them that you mentioned were Jewish.
Yes, exactly. There was also a push to reintroduce music of Jewish composers, so not only music by people like Mendelssohn, but also Jewish American composers. Leonard Bernstein, for example, visited post-war Germany in 1948 and played not only with the Munich Philharmonic, but also with a group called the Ex-Concentration Camp Orchestra, a group of Holocaust survivors. And so this period is really rich in nuance with different groups and peoples that you would think would be quite antagonistic to one another who were working together in the service of music.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because obviously Germany had a huge tradition of music. We can name composer after composer there. But right after the Nazis took over in 1933, they went after controlling any aspect of the cultural life in Germany. And one of them was music.
Yes.
I mean, rejecting anything that had any connection with Jewish culture, and obviously trying to elevate the values of the German culture. And of course, that's why Wagner was Hitler's favorite, by all means. The thing is, to what extent do you think the Nazis were successful in trying to keep away the German people from this other type of alternative type of music that was there? Because they hated jazz, for example.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and scholars are still sort of unpacking that. There's a great book that came out last year by Pamela Potter called The Art of Suppression, where she talks about the efforts of the Reichs Musikkammer, the organization you mentioned that monitored music during the Third Reich. And she looks specifically at what kinds of music they wanted to promote and what kinds of music in Nazi Germany were considered to be degenerate or unwanted. When I look back at the concert programs that happened in the days following the Second World War, one of the things that fascinated me was that many of the ensembles immediately played Mendelssohn, who was a German Jewish composer, though he converted to Christianity, whose music was not considered acceptable by the Nazis. And so again and again in 1945, you see what were called these liberation concerts, where German ensembles would sit down and play things like Beethoven and Mendelssohn. And this happened really all across Germany, to the extent that an American music officer noted in his report something along the lines of, the Mendelssohn situation is critical and urgent, because he was so sick of hearing Felix Mendelssohn's violin concerto for the 50,000th time. And so it's interesting in this way that music was brought back so quickly as some way in which people could assert anti-fascism, if we can take that, of course, with a grain of salt as well.
Sure. The other interesting thing is, although many Jewish performers were left Germany, and others were banned and even ended up in a concentration camp, is something that a lot of people don't know, but there were actually symphony orchestras a certain extent in concentration camps.
Yes, yeah.
And they were tolerated, I guess, in part propaganda to show that the concentration camps were not as bad as people imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that would have been in a place like Terezin, or Theresienstadt, as the Germans called it, which was basically a holding point before people were sent to Auschwitz. The cultural life there was very much sustained and supported by the Nazis, as you say, purely for propaganda purposes. One of the projects I'm working on now is actually looking into the history of a group called the Ex-Concentration Camp Orchestra. It was a group of Eastern European survivors who formed in May 1945 and who basically toured West Germany until 1949, where they played for other Holocaust survivors in displaced persons camps. And so in this way, what I find so fascinating about their performances is that the group made the conscious choice to actually wear recreations of their striped pajama uniforms, and they actually sewed their own prisoner numbers on these uniforms as well. I've had the good fortune to actually meet a couple of the descendants of the orchestra. Sonia Becker was a New York City school teacher and who lives in Brooklyn with her husband still, and she's been very kind to share with me her family's resources and papers. Her mother was the pianist of the group, Fanny Dermashkin. And so this is one of the ways in which I think that period shows a lot of contradictions and a lot of strength and empowerment from people who survived this period.
The other thing I found also interesting, and that this is really unknown to most people, is the fact that in the U.S. there were a lot of prisoners camps for Germans. I think at some point we had 450,000 of them, especially in the South and Texas and all that sort of things. And within those concentration camps, actually, they also formed some orchestras. And I think that hasn't been that much studied, correct?
No, you're exactly right. I read a New York Times article, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, about these very camps. And I had never come across them before that. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay, now, you have an upcoming book titled Rubble Music, Occupying the Ruins of Post-War Berlin. To what extent do you think that the Allies in general and the Americans in particular really had a very clear agenda about using music to denazify Germany? And do you think they were successful in doing that?
I think that there was kind of a tension in the American military about music as entertainment and music as culture, or culture with a capital K. And I think that some of the initiatives certainly fell flat. So they would try and make concerts of Bach, Beethoven, and then maybe David Diamond, a fairly unknown American composer. And the German public responded in ways that were not always extremely positive. They had a few concerts in which they passed out surveys at the end where people could fill this out anonymously. And there was many of the responses were critical. There were a few that were positive. And so I think in terms of measuring success, this is the trickier question to kind of answer. What I will say is that some of the pieces that the Americans brought with them, like Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings, were pieces that did stick around in the repertoire even after the early occupation period. And so I think success may have been more limited and more targeted to composers like Copland and Barber. But I do think this idea of cultural exchange was opened up in 1945 by bringing artists and music to the ruins of Germany.
Another thing that I find interesting in a cultural context is the fact that a few years ago, the Israeli Symphony Orchestra voted to play Wagner.
Yes.
And despite the fact that they did that, the government said no. So to what extent should we mix politics with culture in something that, we all know that Wagner was an anti-Semitic, but so were a lot of people at that time anyway, to the point that almost censor the piece of a great composer, because he was a great composer, because of these political reasons. Yeah,
you've come right to the heart of the matter. And I think when this happened, Berenbaum, the conductor, paused to let people exit the hall who wished to leave, which was also an interesting choice. One thing that when I'm teaching Wagner to my students, that I encounter similar kinds of questions and concerns, and what I try and make clear is that, of course, Wagner died well before the Nazis came to power. Now, that's not to say his writings, of course, about this and the way in which his Jewish characters were portrayed, that was, of course, highly anti-Semitic. And I think that we need to keep all of this fuller picture in mind when considering the work of someone like Richard Wagner. I don't necessarily think that banning Wagner does people any favors, because what people don't know, they're forced to sort of repeat. And so I think it's important to acknowledge it, but to frame it in a certain context, and that's what musicologists love to do all the time, is frame things, dissect things.
Now, you earlier mentioned Leonard Bernstein, who is the most famous American-born conductor, and he went to Germany many times. He recorded there, and he was a particular fan of Mahler, Gustav Mahler. And to the point that when he was interred, he asked to get into the casket with a copy of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Do you think that because of his love of German composers and the activity he carried out not only in Germany but also in Austria, he helped to build a bridge between these old conceptions and himself being Jewish?
Oh, absolutely. I think Bernstein was one of these rare, incredible, charismatic personalities who wore multiple hats and did it brilliantly, especially when he visited post-war Germany in 1948. He was young. He happened to be really on the way to conduct the Palestine Symphony Orchestra, and he was so far the only performer that I know who was Jewish who conducted a German ensemble and a Jewish survivor ensemble in the same weekend, and did so in German as well, I should say. For the Munich Philharmonic, they were quite skeptical when young Bernstein stepped up there, and by the end, the report goes that they would have died for him. They absolutely loved his conducting, and he conducted from the piano. He also played Ravel's piano concerto in that concert. So I think that when we look to these certain kinds of musical personalities, someone like Bernstein absolutely built bridges between the U.S. and post-war Germany in this period.
Yeah, and I think he was highly respected by both German and Austrian, not only musicians but also the audiences.
Yes,
Absolutely. Which is not an easy thing to do.
Exactly. And when you look at other musicians, the great violinist Yehudi Menuhin ran into a lot of problems actually when he played in post-war Germany with Wilhelm Furtwängler, the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, because many Jewish survivors felt that it was too soon to appear in Germany with a German orchestra and a German conductor. So
it's interesting how politics and human conditions sometimes taint what should be a more civil discourse in those things. Have you found any similarity to what happened in this particular post-war Germany situation in any other country? Have you found any parallelism?
I have actually. I just organized a seminar with a colleague of mine at UC Santa Barbara, and last year at the American Musicological Society, we gave a seminar about urban destruction and music, and how musicians really across the globe in various time periods have used rubble and ruin to their advantage to make music out of it. And we looked at things like post-earthquake Haiti. We looked at pieces like the bombs of Beirut. We looked at other contexts like the rubble of Vienna after the Vienna Congress in the early 19th century. We had people that talked about the Marshall Islands and the U.S. nuclear testing, and how the ruined voices of the female islanders there sing today in songs about the nuclear testing. And so absolutely, I think this narrative of people making music to sort of work through trauma after destruction is one that we can apply in many different contexts and in many different eras.
And since we were talking about Leonard Bernstein, I remember that after the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Yes.
he promoted the idea of performing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode of Joy, like saying, okay, this is over, we should all be happy.
Yeah.
And that was a tremendous success.
It was. Absolutely. And making certain word substitutions to speak to that point. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. You also have work about music in films.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering because a lot of people just become familiar with the big hits like the Star Wars or things like that kind of music. Yeah. But I don't think that people realize how much of a role music play in films, because it's kind of in the background, but they are telling a lot of stories, and a good composer really enhances the film. It's not just a kind of a background noise there.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us about your research in that area.
So what I recently just finished was an article about these very early documentary films about the Holocaust that the Allies made. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine that many of the images are quite difficult to look at. Very grisly, and that at the time in 1945, this footage was really unknown to people outside of a small circle. Mm-hmm. And so what I was recently working on was the way in which this footage was scored. How did music add an emotional element or a personal element to these stories, which from the images could be quite massive and almost personless in some sense. Yeah. And what's interesting is that much of the footage is footage that appears in really all of the atrocity films, but each occupier used different music. So the Russians might use Tchaikovsky, the Americans might use silence, the French might use Schumann, and thinking about why these kinds of choices were made.
This is interesting because I'm thinking right now of the movie Apocalypse Now.
Oh, okay.
Where all these helicopters are attacking and all that kind of thing, and they use the Wagner Valkyrias. Yeah. In a way, it's making a connection between this warlike machine with fascism and all that sort of things. Yeah. And that particular part of the movie wouldn't be the same thing without that music. I cannot think of any music you can even compose that will hit exactly what they were looking for.
Yeah, people have said actually that Wagner is the first film music composer, and I have to say I do agree with this, because whenever I hear his music in film, it's so evocative. Another example of that would be I'm blanking on the name right now. It'll come to me. It's a film about basically the end of the earth, and they play the prelude from Tristan and Isolde, which is a very evocative.
Oh yes, I remember the movie. It's about the moon getting very close to the earth and colliding to the earth, which in the end of our planet. I cannot remember the title either. Yeah. But yes, that's very good. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Abby Anderton for this talk about music, history, culture. You chose certainly a period of time that is very interesting, much more interesting than you may sound. And as they say in German, Dankeschön.
Oh, danke.
and next week we're going to have here David Milch, who is the director of the Master of Arts Administration at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, who will be talking about the business of arts. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. All rights reserved, 2018.